this first verse of Ruth is it's really rich with meaning, and I think um, it really helps set the stage for us on what's going on at this time period and some of the struggles that Naomi and her family had when it came to their spiritual life, if you will. And so we'll just read the first verse here. We'll get started. It says, "Now it came to pass in the days when the judges ruled that there was a famine in the land. And a certain man of Bethlehem, Judah, went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his two sons." And so before we get into the journey that they took into the land of Moab, we got to spend some time understanding what's going on and understanding the historical, because we just talked about Rahab. And the account of Rahab in Joshua chapter 2 was at the very forefront of Israel's entrance into the promised land. But when we look here in Ruth chapter 1, we're talking about it's about a generation after Israel has come into the promised land. And there's a significant statement when he states that it was in the days when the judges ruled. So this is following the death of Joshua. It's following the death of many of those leaders that were with Joshua during that time period. And so understanding something about the nature of the book of Judges is helpful to understand the political, the economic, and most importantly, the spiritual climate that was going on in Israel at that time. In Judges chapter 2, verse 7, we see something about this day in which the book of Ruth was written, the historical context. And so Judges chapter 2, verse 7 states that the people served the Lord all the days of Joshua and all the days of the elders that outlived Joshua, who had seen all the great works of the Lord that he did for Israel. And Joshua, the son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died, being 110 years old. And they buried him in the border of his inheritance in Timnath Heres in the mount of Ephraim on the north side of the hill Gash. And also all that generation were gathered unto their fathers. And there arose another generation after them, which knew not the Lord, nor yet the works which he had done for Israel. And so we see very quickly the spiritual deterioration that occurred in the nation of Israel after they came into the land of Israel. The generation following that of Joshua and his fellow leaders, there was just this moral decay that resulted. And the lessons that were learned by the nation by trusting in God towards the end of the wilderness and seeing him push out the nations of the promised land, they were falling on deaf ears with this second generation here. We see in verse 11, it says, "The children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord and served Balaam. And they forsook the Lord God of their fathers, which brought them out of the land of Egypt, and followed other gods, of the gods of the people that were round about them, and bowed themselves unto them, and provoked the Lord to anger." And we actually looked at some of these verses in the previous lesson. But we also see this idea, and the book of Judges really can be summarized by two statements that we see in the book. Judges chapter 17, verse 6 is the first time we see this mentioned. But it states that in those days there was no king in Israel, but every man did that which was right in his own eyes. So we have the law being given to the nation as they're in the wilderness on Mount Sinai. And God established these rules and regulations for the nation, essentially to curb their sin natures. And as you go through Deuteronomy and you look at, go through the various books that deal with the law, we see that God used a system of sticks and carrots, really, blessings and cursings to provide motivation for them to obey his law. But it was to rein in their rampant sin natures. They didn't, of course, the Holy Spirit had not been given yet. We don't see that being given until the church of Pentecost. And so they're not getting the outside help that you and I get as believers in Jesus Christ to do the right thing. And so God provides the law in order to demonstrate to them their sinfulness, to curb that sin nature, if you will, by bludgeoning it or providing motivation for, an attaboy for doing the right thing. But at this point of Israel's history, the law was not serving as their moral compass. They were doing, as the author of Judges says, they were doing that which was right in their own eyes. They were kind of making a determination for themselves, irregardless of what the law said when they're making their choices. And Proverbs talks about, in Proverbs 14, verse 11, you see there in the notes, that there is a way which seemeth right unto a man, but the end thereof are the ways of death. What would happen to an Israelite living during this time period who allowed their sin nature just kind of be just unchecked? Well, they would die, right? If the Israelites didn't take care of business, God was going to do it through his the covenant curses. And so what we see here is the author of the Proverbs here is stating that for an individual who is plotting their own course apart from the law, the end was going to be death. And so at this time period in which we see here the book of Ruth being written, we see that the curses of the law were in full effect during the time period of Judges. There was famine. There was nations that would come in, sweep in, and kill, and that they would ruin their agriculture and take their homes and ravish their women and basically take up ownership or take up rule in Israel during periods of time. But one of the things I found interesting when I was reading the book of Ruth, there aren't many, I don't really necessarily see any kind of moral condemnation. The author of Ruth is not pointing out, well, they did wrong and they did bad. Remember, the audience, the original audience of the book of Ruth would have been Jews under the law. This statement talking about the days and when the judges ruled, that should have been a red flag that, okay, all right, we're in the middle of some pretty hard times because of Israel's disobedience. This was a time period when the spiritual climate was every man doing that which was right in his own eyes, rather than people being obedient to the law of Moses. And so, really, what I think that the author is doing here is he's allowing the audience to make their own moral judgments based off of their understanding of the spiritual climate, based off of their understanding of the law. And I think that helps us as we go through this. And so we see this family in verse 1. We're introduced to this family who are living in the days of Judges, right? So the spiritual climate is individuals making their own judgments apart from the law. And during this time period, there was a famine in the land. Once again, as a Jew growing up in the law and being familiar with the covenant blessings and cursings, this should have been a red flag, right? Danger. What is it? What's that show? Danger, Will Robinson. Lost in Space, right? Yeah. No, my dad's a big science fiction guy, and he's kind of a goofball, and every once in a while he just randomly be like, Danger, Will Robinson, Danger, Will Robinson. Usually it's if I didn't put my seatbelt on in the car, he'd start quoting that robot there. But this should have been a blazing red flag, right? For the people reading this letter, that there was a famine in the land, because the curses of for violating the Mosaic law, one of the curses was famine. Let's look at Deuteronomy chapter 11. Deuteronomy 11, verse 16. Says, take heed to yourselves that your heart be not deceived, and ye turn aside and serve other gods and worship them. And then the Lord's wrath be kindled against you, and he shut up the heaven that there be no rain, and that the land yield not her fruit, unless ye perish quickly from off the land which the Lord giveth you. If we go to chapter 28 of Deuteronomy, we also see this listed in This is in Deuteronomy 28 is a more complete listing of the curses. But once again, we see God reiterating, right, to the nation that as a result of disobeying the commandments that he had provided them, one of the curses would be the fact that there would be no agricultural produce. And he says in verse 23, he says that, and thy heaven that is over thy head shall be brass, and the earth that is under thee shall be iron. The Lord shall make the rain of thy land powder and dust. From heaven shall it come down upon thee until thou be destroyed. And so stating here this idea that there wouldn't be any kind of agricultural increase. Verse 38 of the same chapter, he says, Thou shalt carry much seed out into the field, and thou shalt gather but little in, for the locust shall consume it. Thou shalt plant vineyards and dress them, but shalt neither drink of the wine nor gather the grapes, for the worms shall eat them. Thou shalt have olive trees throughout all thy coast, but thou shalt not anoint thyself with the oil, for thine olive shall cast his fruit. And they shall beget sons and daughters, but thou shalt not enjoy them, for they shall go into captivity. All thy trees and the fruit of thy land shall the locust consume. I lived on a farm in Pennsylvania for about 6 years when I was growing up, and they grew corn and alfalfa. They also had cattle, grazed cattle and whatnot. And I was younger, so I didn't work on the farm. My uncle ran it, but I knew enough to know that farming that's a hard job. It is relentless, as many of you folks are familiar with that. And can you imagine just putting all the sweat of your brow and your back and your labor and all that into it and not being able to produce anything? And God is saying here that if you guys you can disobey the covenant, that one of the curses was that there wouldn't be anything to eat, that there would be famine. And so when a Jewish individual was reading this, that it was a time period in which famine was in the land, it would have been a red flag that, wait a second, the nation at that time must have been doing something. They must have been disobedient. They must have been doing that which was right in their own eyes. And it states that as a result of this famine, as we go back to the book of Ruth, states that a certain man of Bethlehem, Judah, went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. And the name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi, and the name of his 2 sons Mahlon and Chilion, Ephrathites of Bethlehem, Judah. And they came into the country of Moab and continued there. And so the word that's translated sojourn, the Hebrew word ger, has the idea of to dwell for an extended period of time in an area. Someone who's a stranger, someone who's not from that area, but they have taken up root in that particular area. I remember when I first moved down to Florida, and I've been there for a little while, and I was ordering some food at a restaurant, food establishment, and I don't know, I got a chicken sandwich or something, and I wanted something to drink. And so I say to this girl, I said, "Oh, yeah, can I get a bottle of water?" And she starts looking at me like, what are you talking about? I'm like, "Yeah, you got them right back there, a bottle of water." And she's still looking at me like, "Dude, what's wrong with you?" And I'm like, "Wait a second. Okay, I'm not near Philadelphia anymore." I said, "Can I have a bottle of water?" She was like, "Oh, yeah, I can get one of those for you." Right? It was very evident that I was a sojourner, right? I was not a native of that particular part of the country, and I've been there for quite a period of time. But we see this word being used of individuals like Lot. It is in Genesis chapter 9 about Lot's stay in Sodom. And we know that Lot was in there for an extended period of time, enough to be having a position of authority and position of established position in that city. Right? In Genesis chapter 21, verse 34, it says that Abraham, he sojourned, or he stayed in that land with the Philistines for many days. We also see Jacob sojourning with Laban, and he was with his uncle for a period of close to 20 years. So just trying to get the idea, understanding that this sojourning in the land of Moab, this was not it just it wasn't running down to the convenience store for a loaf of bread and and a thing of milk. They were taking up some residence in this particular area for a while. It was definitely wasn't a short duration. I also see here that there's a bit of irony in the names of the individuals in this account. I don't want to say story. I always try to. So our Pastor Daniel, he's a retired head pastor. He always makes a big, always make sure you say an account or something, a historical account, and that because you start thinking of stories, start thinking of something that's made up. And the way I used to explain to my kids was it's a makey uppy story. It's not a makey uppy story. That's not talking about, cotton candy clouds and milkshakes and trying to get the kids to bed. We're talking about an actual historical account here. And these individuals, their names are somewhat ironic when you consider what's going on in this historical account here. But Elimelech, his name means my God is king. And what we see here, and as we're going to go through the scriptures, we're going to see that it seemed like Elimelech was doing anything but considering God to be his king. And Naomi's name meaning pleasantness, we're going to see towards the end, she says, "Call me Mara. I'm no longer the pleasant one. I'm the bitter one, right? I'm the angry one." And then the sons being named Malon and Chilion, sickly and pining. This is a bit of a side, but uh, I think we were talking today about careful not to tell God what you're not going to do. Wasn't that a discussion? God really had, what's that?
That's Peggy.
Peggy.
Still Peggy.
God he has a pretty interesting sense of humor. And I find that his humor is very ironic. I remember saying before I got saved, I worked for my dad one time before, and I'm saying I'm never working at Coke again. I mean, that was the first run around it was a rough job, and after I got saved, God was like, "This is where I want you to work," and like and I just find God's humor being very ironic. But we see the irony in their names, and it really was not indicative of how they responded to things. And so we see this family departing from Israel, departing from Israel to Moab. And I don't think oftentimes we have a full appreciation for how significant this was. And maybe it's because of our culture, right? We tend to allow our culture and our way of life to bleed into scriptures often. We tend to look back on it and project into their lives what our life is like. And so in American society, to simply move to get a better job, it's very common, isn't it? Right? I mean, like if you can get a promotion or there's something along the lines, there's nothing to it to move 2 states over, 3 states over. We live in a very mobile society. But when you understand God's relationship to the nation of Israel, the fact that they moved out of Israel is very, very significant. And so the question is, Elimelech and Naomi leaving Israel for what they thought were greener pastures in Moab, why is that such a big deal? Because we have some of the patriarchs, they did the same exact thing. Let's turn to Genesis chapter 12, verse 10. Genesis 12, verse 10. For the same reasons, right, as Abram journeyed in the promised land that God had promised him, we see in verse 10 that there was a famine in the land. And Abram went down into Egypt to sojourn there, for the famine was grievous in the land. God doesn't necessarily rebuke him for doing that or moving away. He moves into Egypt. There are brighter prospects there of food. You've got to be able to put bacon on the table for your family, of course. I'm sure that's what he was assuming. And so we see him moving down into Egypt, but he does return. Isaac goes through a similar situation. There's famine in the land, and he moves to the land of Gerar. God does tell him not to go down to Egypt. And then, of course, we have the account of Jacob and his family moving into the land of Goshen, right? God sent Joseph ahead of them to prepare a way, to provide for them. And they leave the promised land. They go down to Goshen. They end up being there, right, for 400 years as they are caught up in slavery. But one of the important caveats for us to remember here is that these three instances of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, them leaving and moving out of the land of Israel, this was all before the law was given. This is all before the covenant was established with Moses. And this was before God brought them into the promised land. And I think that's going to play a big role in us understanding just how significant it was for Elimelech and Naomi to be moving out of Israel into one of these surrounding nations. And I think as we go through these scriptures, we're going to see that God's intention was for Israel to stay in the land. It wasn't supposed to be a base of operations where they could hang out when times were good and then leave to find greener pastures. This is where he wanted them to stay. These are where the promises to them would be fulfilled. And so we see here in Genesis chapter 15 and verse 18 that God is saying that this is your inheritance. This is what I have provided for you when he tells Abraham. He says, in the same day, verse 18, the Lord made a covenant with Abram and saying, unto thy seed have I given this land, from the river of Egypt unto the great river, the river Euphrates, the Kenites, the Kenizzites, and the Cadmonites, and the Hittites, and the Perizzites, and the Rephaims, Amorites, and the Canaanites, and the Girgashites, and the Jebusites. He says, this is your place for you to stay. Then we see here in Genesis chapter 17, we'll go 2 chapters over in verse 6. He promises Abraham, he says in verse 5, he says, I'll make you a father of many nations, and I will make thee exceeding fruitful, and I will make nations of thee, and kings shall come out of thee. And I will establish my covenant between me and thee and thy seed after thee in their generations for an everlasting covenant, to be a God unto thee and to thy seed after thee. And I will give unto thee and to thy seed after thee the land wherein thou art a stranger, all the land of Canaan, for an everlasting possession, and I will be their God. We see that God wanted them to hold on to this land. This was a land that was going to be theirs, and it was going to be theirs forever. In Deuteronomy, we see Moses kind of reiterating these promises. He reminds them before they enter into the land that this is the land that we are now entering, the land that we're going in when we cross over the Jordan River. This is your land, the land that God promised Abraham. This is the land that you are to enjoy. And so let's go ahead and turn to Deuteronomy chapter 11. Verse 8, he says, therefore shall ye keep all the commandments which I command you this day, that ye may be strong and go in and possess the land whither ye go to possess it, and that ye may prolong your days in the land which the Lord sware unto your fathers to give unto them and to their seed, a land that floweth with milk and honey. For the land whither thou goest in to possess it is not as the land of Egypt, from whence ye came out, where thou sowest thy seed and waterest it with thy foot as a garden of herbs. But the land whither ye go to possess it is a land of hills and valleys, and drinketh water of the rain of heaven. And look at this terminology here, verse 12. A land which the Lord thy God careth for. The eyes of the Lord thy God are always upon it, from the beginning of the year even unto the end of the year. You think about maybe taking your kids to a park and it's full of, all these kids are running around and just a lot of activity. You're sitting there and you're watching your kids play. Your eyes are glued on them. You're concerned about whether they're going to jump off the top of the jungle gym, or whether they're going to try to surf down the slide or whatever, right? But your intention is directed to those little ones. Why? Because they're precious to you. And we see here that God's stating that my eyes are upon this land. This is where my attention is focused. This land that I have promised you that you guys are to be living in. And then we go to chapter 12, verse 10. He says, but when ye go over Jordan and dwell in the land which the Lord your God giveth you to inherit, and when he giveth you rest from all your enemies round about, so that ye dwell in safety, then there shall be a place which the Lord your God shall choose to cause his name to dwell there. Thither shall ye bring all that I command you, your burnt offerings and your sacrifices, your tithes and the heave offering of your hand, and all your choice vows which ye shall vow unto the Lord. And ye shall rejoice before the Lord your God, ye and your sons and your daughters and your men servants and your maidservants and the Levite that is within your gates, for as much as he hath no part nor inheritance with you. Take heed to thyself um, yeah, we'll go ahead and stop there. Do you see that in verse 11? He's saying, it is in this land that God is going to choose a place for his name. In that land, there's going to be a place where you can come to worship me. He's not providing them any kind of opportunity that there's a way to be pleasing to him outside of the land here. He's saying, this is the land I promised you. This is the land that I brought you into and cast the people out. This is the land that my attention and my care is being directed on. And this is the land in which I want you to serve me. If we turn to Psalm 128, I think we see that the psalmist here is indicating that the idea was you stayed in the land and you grew old in the land and you enjoyed it. He says, verse 4, behold, that thus shall the man be blessed that feareth the Lord. The man that stood in fear of the law was happy. That happiness many times was derived from the fact that there were blessings according to the law. And he says here that the Lord shall bless thee out of Zion, and thou shalt see the good of Jerusalem all the days of thy life. This satisfaction, this happiness was the fact that these individuals could sit and watch and be near Jerusalem, this city in which God had told them that they would meet and they would worship. And he says, all the days of thy life. He didn't want them going apart from it. He didn't want them leaving the land. His desire was that they would stay in the land. I think another significant thing about this is the curses. If you're familiar with the Mosaic curses, and we'll see that, we go ahead and turn to Deuteronomy chapter 28. They are they kind of start out, I wouldn't say that any of these curses were pleasant, but some of them seem to be maybe somewhat tolerable. If you've got a lot of grit, you could probably handle some of these curses. It would make life miserable and terrible, but then they get increasingly worse and worse and worse. We see the curses beginning in verse 15. And we'll just go real briefly through this. And he says that they will be cursed in the city and cursed in the field. Cursed shall be their basket and their store. Cursed shall be the fruit of the body. And then it starts picking up, kind of like a snowball rolling downhill and turning into a bit of an avalanche. And then he starts talking about that pestilence will cleave unto you, and that the Lord will smite thee with a consumption and with a fever and with inflammation and extreme burning. That doesn't sound too pleasant. Then he starts talking about the famines in verse 23 and 24. Then he says that there will be enemies that come in verse 25, and you'll be smitten by your enemies, that there would be invaders, and they would raid, and that they would kill Israelites. Then he says in verse 27 that some of the plagues that God sent on Egypt, that they would experience these. And they're starting to get worse and worse and worse. But the thing is, if we go down to verse 63, the final curse, right? The ultimate curse for the nation of Israel for covenant disobedience was not death. It was not famine. It wasn't some kind of a disease. It was being taken out of the land. The worst thing that could happen to an Israelite, right, and the nation of Israel, from God's perspective, is that they would be removed from the promised land. He says in verse 63, and it shall come to pass that as the Lord rejoiced over you to do you good and to multiply you, so the Lord will rejoice over you to destroy you and to bring you to naught. And ye shall be plucked up from off the land whither thou goest to possess it. And the Lord shall scatter thee among all people from the one end of the earth even unto the other. And there thou shalt serve other gods, which neither thou nor thy fathers have known, even wood and stone. And among these nations thou shalt have no ease, neither shall the sole of thy foot have rest, but the Lord shall give thee there a trembling heart, and failing of eyes, and sorrow of mind. And thy life shall hang in doubt before thee, and thou shalt fear day and night, and shall have none assurance of thy life. And I just find it really interesting that as God details these curses that he was going to bring upon the nation for their disobedience, and as they got worse and worse and worse, the final one was, I'm going to pluck you out of the land that I promised your forefather Abraham, the land in which my gaze and my care is constantly on. I'm going to remove you from that land. This leaving the land of Israel was not something that should have been done lightly or callously by the Israelites. And then we also see that there were national religious festivals that were supposed to be celebrated in the land. 3 times a year, there was, according to the law, there was required male attendance in order to celebrate the feast of Passover, the feast of weeks and booths. Why are these things significant? Well, remember, in the spiritual condition in Judges was that every man did that which was right in their own eyes. I don't know how much consideration Elimelech and Naomi had about the things that we mentioned here, but it seems like they were making a choice to find material prosperity, and they did not value what God stated for the nation of Israel, that his desire for them to be in the land, that this was an inheritance, that this is where God wanted them to be, regardless of whether things were going well or not. And really, what we see here is that I think it demonstrates a lack of appreciation for the covenant relationship that they had as being members of the nation of Israel. And so here's what happens. Shortly after going into the land, we go back to the book of Ruth in verse 3, and it says, "And Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left and her 2 sons. And they took them wives of the women of Moab, and the name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other was Ruth. And they dwelled there about 10 years. And Mahlon and Chilion died also, both of them, and the woman was left of her 2 sons and her husband." So here they are. They've sojourned into the land of Moab, outside of the borders of Israel at that time. And we don't know how long Elimelech was in the land of Moab before he died, but it does appear that it would be sooner rather than later. And we see that he passed away. And I think what we see in the notes, it says the Jewish audiences are left to make their own inference as to why Elimelech died. Most Jews would probably made the assumption that there is a connection between their choice of leaving the land and these curses and his death. Shortly thereafter, we see that their boys, Mahlon and Chilion, sickly and puny or pining, they marry 2 Moabite women. And I think this is just another red flag, because there are countless admonitions to the nation of Israel in the Old Testament scriptures not to allow their children to marry pagans, to marry Gentiles. We could turn to Deuteronomy chapter 7, verse 1. We see this mentioned. Deuteronomy 7:1 says, "When the Lord thy God shall bring thee into the land whither thou goest to possess it, and hath cast out many nations before thee, the Hittites and the Girgashites and the Amorites and the Canaanites and the Perizzites and the Hivites and the Jebusites, 7 nations greater and mightier than thou. And when the Lord thy God shall deliver them before thee, thou shalt smite them and utterly destroy them. Thou shalt make no covenant with them, nor show mercy unto them. Neither shalt thou make marriages with them. Thy daughter thou shalt not give unto his son, nor his daughter shalt thou take unto thy son. For they will turn away thy son from following me, that they may serve other gods. So will the anger of the Lord be kindled against you and destroy thee suddenly." And so we see these passages warning these Jewish families not to allow this intermarriage to take place because of the potential for turning the hearts of these Jewish men and Jewish women away from the one true God. Now, you will probably notice that in verse 1, the land of Moab is not mentioned, but the Moabites did worship other gods. They worship Chemosh and they worship Baal and a variety of other gods. And so the principle is at play here. And it seems that there wasn't an appreciation for the fact on the part of Elimelech and Naomi about the potential for spiritual idolatry, the fact that their sons married into these Moabite women. And also considering the fact that it was the prophet Baal who encouraged the king of Moab to have the Moabite women to seduce the Israelite men so that they would turn to idolatry. And so this would have also been something, this was something that happened just a generation prior. And so there was a very real potential for Mahlon and Chilion for their hearts to be turned away from Jehovah because of the women that they married. We also see in Deuteronomy chapter 23, verse 3, let's go ahead and turn there. There's a warning about these intermarriages and the offspring of these intermarriages. In verse 3, it states that an Ammonite or a Moabite shall not enter into the congregation of the Lord, even to their 10th generation shall they not enter into the congregation of the Lord forever. Because they met you not with bread and with water in the way when ye came forth out of Egypt, and because they hired against thee Balaam, the son of Beor of Pethor of Mesopotamia, to curse thee. So he's stating here that an offspring of a Jewish person who's married a Moabite, that they would not be able to come and worship in the congregation of the Lord for up to 10 generations. So why is that important? Well, if Naomi was thinking about her grandchildren and her great-grandchildren, if there was ever potential that she would return to Israel, that her grandsons up to the 10th generation wouldn't be able to enjoy worshiping in the congregation of the Lord. And so it seems like there's this spiritual indifference to these things that God said they're important to him, that worship was to be done in the land, that the land in which God's eye was on, it was the land of Israel and not outside of that particular area, that the blessings that God had promised Israel, that it was for them when they were dwelling in the land. And yet we see Naomi's family remaining in the land of Moab even after the death of her husband. So it kind of leads me to consider if this was all Elimelech's doing, right? Because at this time period, it was a very patriarchal society. You know, Elimelech made the decision, everybody else didn't have a choice. But at that point, if Naomi and her sons didn't like the choice of her husband and he passed away, they would have had the freedom to return back to the land of Israel, back to the promised land. And yet we still see them remaining there. And the scriptures point to the fact that they dwelt there in verse 4 for 10 years. So what do we see here? The thought process, right? The thought process during the time of Judges was everyone did that which is right in their own eyes. There's got to be a measure of sympathy for Naomi and Elimelech and folks living at the land at that time, right? When you don't know how you're going to put food on your table for your family, that tugs on you. When you see someone that you love struggling, or when you're, and especially maybe as a dad or as a father or as a boss, you want to provide that answer, right? Guys, you guys are fixers, right? We're fixers. We want to come up with a solution. We got to make this problem better. And Elimelech's eyes were cast on Moab as a place where, hey, I've got to feed my family. But he seemed to have made these decisions apart from what God had said that he wanted for the nation of Israel. And so the fact that they were seemingly operating by sight and valuing this, the prospect of security and provision over faith in God and his promises by leaving the land, what we see is it resulting in spiritual, emotional, and a relational cost. They saw that Moab was an opportunity to provide for their family, to survive, right? And they made this choice apart from what God stated in the law. And then they're going to pay a price for that. I I'm a bit of a history nerd, and I've had an interest in the West for about the last 5 years or so. We visited a couple of states out west, and so we've enjoyed it. And I read a book on the Donner Party, not the feel good book of the year, but if sounds like some of you are familiar with them, and but you have these folks that were emigrating from the Midwest, and so they're individuals coming from Illinois and a variety of the states in that particular area. And there were prospects of a better way of life, right? California, we're going to go there and the land of plenty, and they hop on there and they get on the Oregon Trail, and I'm sure some of them when they're on the Oregon Trail they died of dysentery and cholera, like some of you probably when you were playing the Oregon Trail, you probably died on the way there, right? But as they're traveling across the continent, right, and they're coming across and they run into this guy as this prospector who promised them a shortcut to California. And the party that the traveling party, they divided. There was a group that continued to take the traditional Oregon Trail, and this other branch, the Donner Party, broke off and followed this guy who was basically a flim-flam, con artist who took off and left them high and dry in the Sierra Nevadas, where basically they couldn't go any further and they had a historical snow dump. And so you know the rest of the story. I'm not going to get into the gory details about all their death and whatnot, but um, here you had this party of individuals that had the prospects of prosperity and a better way of life, and they headed off in a direction, and what they ended up having was pain, misery, and death. And we see that here in the life of Naomi and her family. There are prospects of a better way of life in Moab. And yet God had said, I want you to trust me. I want you to hope in my mercy, even though there's famine in the land, because this is where my attention is. This is the land that I want you in. And I think what we see here is the beginning of the contrast between Naomi and Rahab, right? Rahab didn't have any promises from God, but she hoped in his mercy. She hoped in the one true God as being as a merciful God, and she didn't know what that was going to look like. Naomi, on the other hand, and her husband, they could have hoped in his character. They could have stayed in the land in the land that they knew God wanted them to worship in, and yet they set their sights on somewhere outside of that land. And the end result ended up being pain and hurt and death. And we begin seeing this distinction between these two women and where they were placing their hope at. Unfortunately, as we get into this study and we look a little bit further about Naomi, and she allowed circumstances to flavor her view of who God is. And sometimes we're guilty of that too. I'm sure we've met twice. I don't know the hurts. I don't know the pain. I don't know the difficulties that God has allowed in your life, but I know oftentimes in my life, sometimes I've allowed the circumstances to color my perspective on who God is, rather than trusting in his goodness in spite of that, right? God's desire is for us, um, by faith, continue to trust that he is a good God, even when life may not be good. And it seems that in Naomi's life, she struggled to believe that and believe in trust, and that is the character of God. Um, And what we're going to see is their lack of faith, lack of hope in the mercy of God ends up resulting in misery, whereas we end up seeing in Rahab's life, she was rewarded for living by faith in the character of God. Wish I could have flip-flopped that because it was, that's a bit of a downer to leave on today, but it gets better. So it does get better. But
Um, and yeah, what you say about, the judges and they were there because they were under the curse, I totally get it, but, I do think she must have exhibited some kind of belief for Ruth to say, your God be my God. She must have showed some kind of
Yeah, it's not,
fidelity in
yeah,
her.
no, I understand. And she was initiated to him, right? Because she knew the Lord. Ruth knows the Lord. Um, and so I don't mean to say that Naomi was a terrible human being and that, but she struggled, right? And we as believers, we often do. And I would love to say that, yeah, my faith is like Rahab. As I've gone through this study, I'm like, you know what? I'm more like Naomi than I'd like to admit often. And so I think we can see, though, when we fail to trust in God, we fail to hope in his mercy, that oftentimes we miss out on some blessings. We miss out on privileges of being used, and we miss out on opportunities to see him work in ways that only he can work, right? And we kind of shoot ourselves in the foot when we fail to live by faith in those promises. So I don't, yeah, I think we can commiserate with her. We can understand the difficulty and the difficulty it is to walk by faith in God at times. And that's why I think Rahab's faith, I think that's why he lifts it up, because it is so unique, right? His people often do not live in faith, trusting in him and his promises, right? We're more often like Naomi and her family in that situation. Well, I can't say you, and I say we. I would say at least me, you know. But it's an excellent point. But so there, and I think I try to bring that out tomorrow. That Ruth must have been initiated to who God is through her interactions with Naomi's family.
I have one other question.
Mhm.
On page 2, where Israel needed to go back, attendance at the national festival, and you've listed Passover weeks and booths. Was one of those Pentecost
I think weeks is Pentecost.
weeks? Is
Yes, ma'am.
what? What would we call booth?
Tabernacles. The Feast of Tabernacles, when they celebrated their wilderness wandering, that God brought them through the wilderness. That's when they set up the little huts, and they would live in the huts for, I think, the week or what have you.
So was it a celebration of their care in the wilderness, or
God's provision throughout the wilderness and bringing them through that. Yeah.
I
Right?
just had a kind of like a question, if I understand this right. Rahab, she hid those spies, risked her life to do that, even before there was any kind of a request or promise that her and her family would be saved, right? I mean, she
Yes.
just did that without any promise of anything in return.
Right.
And
Yeah,
now,
she makes the request after she hid them, right? She hid
Yes.
them.
so she did it, yeah, she did it before she even had any assurance that she was gonna be saved.
Yeah, there was no guarantee. You're right. There was no guarantee that those guys were gonna,
Right. She still did it.
Yep.
so.
And that shows a lot about her character as well.
Anybody else? Questions?
Yeah, Ben.
Just want to go back to that time you took your kids and you were speeding. No, I'm kidding.
I don't know if it's 7 years yet.
Yeah.
So I don't know, like,
Yeah, that's the statute of limitations. No, question for you. I know this wasn't the main thrust, but it was certainly you dedicated some time to it in the second message and even a little bit in the first. When Israel is 5 to 6 miles outside of Jericho, and they just plundered and wiped out the armies of Og and Sihon, however you say that. Yeah, it's been a minute since we've done a study of Jericho, and I have heard that it was smaller and it was, I think maybe Tim did something a while in the last couple of years, but I think you mentioned 9 acres, right? Why do you think that story is so propped up? Like in Sunday school, until you present, I always just thought it was like, well, God spent so much time, like dedicated to the story where they go in day after day after day after day, and finally on day 7, we're gonna go 7 times around the city. I mean, how many little kids' Sunday schools have reenacted this, and you blow the trumpets and the walls come down and off we go. It's a kind of a peculiar fact that it was pretty small. And that if he wanted to, he could have said, okay, because I think it's, what is it? It's in the book of, there's somewhere that it talks about the 601,000 soldiers, where you got that.
Yeah.
Or maybe anyways, it's a huge army. They could have just gone in there and meant, all right, siege this wall, enter through this gate.
Yeah.
But he chose to do it supernaturally. And out of that, Rahab, her dwelling somewhere near one of those walls, and she's able to save these spies. So anyways, I just wondered if you contemplated that.
Yeah, I think it would, I mean, I could be wrong, but I think it set a precedent. Right?
Maybe what?
I think it set a precedent. Crossing over Jordan, right? And that was miraculous as well. It was because it was the flood season, and God basically stopped the waters, and so they were able to pass through this flooded river. But then he gets to the other side, and the first battle in the land is going to be won by faith. It was going to be won by, we're going to do it your way, God, not ours. Because, all right, General Norman Schwarzkopf or General Patton, like, all right, storm the wall, boys, right? Let's knock these guys down. We've got the numerical advantage, right? And God's like, nope, we're going to do it my way, right? I'm going to set a precedent for you trusting me, and I'm going to give you these directions, right? That West Point would never teach our military officers. And I want you to march, because the victory is not going to be in your strength. It's going to be in me and me alone. And I think that basically was intended to set a precedent for the nation as they continue to go into the land. God saying, it's going to be me. It's not you guys. I'm the one.
Instructions were preposterous.
Yeah.
Be quiet, walk around the city, then at a certain time I want you to shout. And, I mean, anybody that was a poor guy would say, this is stupid.
Yeah. It's like, are you serious? Get me? Yeah.
So it did require space.
Right.
But
And
Exodus 4:30, it talks about when they saw God doing something, it empowered their faith.
so they had a background, right? I mean, they had these individuals, their parents had told them about the Red Sea. Remember, these folks were basically just stopped eating the manna that God had provided for them. Their shoes had not worn out in 40 years, right? And so there were examples where, hey, this may sound crazy to us, but hey, let's trust them, right? Let's trust them.
However, the New Testament Christian is instructed not to look for those kinds of signs.
Right.
But to live by
That our promises are spiritual, right? We can't tangibly taste or touch or feel the promises that God has made to us as believers in Christ. But I mean, how many Christians you talk to about being in Christ or Christ in you, and they're like, huh? Right? Have you ever tried to share with somebody about the privileges of being in Christ? And they're like, dude, what are you talking about? Okay, so Steve Thomas, some of you met him last time we were out here. He brought me down to a Bible conference in Titusville, I don't know, about 8 years ago, first time. And Pastor Dave Spurbeck was down there, and he was teaching about the believer in Christ and being seated in the heavenlies. And I'm sitting in this, if you know about Pastor Kevin's church, it's a tiny little church, and I'm in there with about 15 other people, and Dave's talking about being in Christ, and I'm looking around, I'm like, what has Steve just gotten me into, man? I'm like, what is it? But I'm sitting there and I'm listening, like, okay, well, it says it in the Bible. Yeah, okay, I see. But so many people are like, that's crazy, that's ludicrous, right? And so these promises that God has made to us as believers in Christ, to the church, the entire church, right? They can be difficult to digest, even for believers, right? And so it's the equivalent of march around this city 7 times, right? It just doesn't make sense. And so that's where the faith comes in, right? Wait a sec, my sin nature feels like right? I feel like I can't control my sin nature. Well, Romans 6, what does it say? You're dead to it, right? You've got to relate to that promise by faith. Wait a second. I don't have to do this. I don't have to give in to my sin nature's appetites and desires, right? Because I'm dead to it. I'm alive to God. But you may feel like, you know, like there's no way you can control yourself. And so I, these promises that God has made Israel in the Old Testament or he's made to the church today, they are equally by faith.
One more math question for you. Maybe you know it, maybe you'd have to look it up, but, and you'll probably talk more about this topic tomorrow, but. So the timing where Rahab comes out is, and I think the scriptures say like. Maybe you read it, or maybe we just skimmed past it, but like her family was saved as well.
Mhm.
I think it's her parents. Was it
Yeah.
siblings?
Yeah.
But obviously it's not Boaz. Because she hasn't
Not yet.
married Salmon.
Right.
To have Boaz the kinsman redeemer. And then so some point during this aftermath, Naomi is in Moab with Ruth. And then eventually they head back to the land where Ruth will meet Boaz,
Right.
which will probably be your topic tomorrow or something concerning that. Do you know what that timeline difference, like how, when Rahab gets saved to the point where Boaz,
Yeah.
where she becomes the next mother-in-law, I guess.
Right. You can't, it's very difficult to be definitive on that because most Bible scholars believe that Ruth occurs in the front end of Judges. But it's very difficult to be specific about the timing. My guess is that Rahab's probably dead by the time that Boaz marries Ruth. He seems to be a
Yeah,
little bit older gentleman. She's a little bit younger. So she probably was a dead mother-in-law. A mother-in-law she never met, but who had a great deal of influence on her son. Um, but it's likely that, yeah, it's likely that he's been around for a minute. He's a little bit older. But I can't give you, I've looked at a variety of articles and nobody could be super definitive.
It says that Joshua was 110 when he died. So if she had any kind of length of life like he did.
Yeah,
Possibly.
it is possible. It is interesting. Her name isn't mentioned in Ruth. You know, you would think maybe if she's around that, you know, her name might be mentioned in Ruth. He does seem to be an older gentleman at that time. So it's hard to be, at least I think it's hard to be definitive on the exact ages, you know.
but you would, I mean, I've always, as I think through this story, yeah, I take Boaz not as he's not 25, but he's still able to
Have
some
kids.
kids.
Yeah,
So, you know, I think of him like a 50-something, 60-something,
right.
maybe.
There you go, Ben.
I mean, I don't think he's as young as 48, that's no, so it's. That's a baby. So.
And you have to remember that at this time, people are still living longer.
Yeah,
You know, I mean, so, you know, as you mentioned, Joshua was 110 years old, and so that was not abnormal. You know, what was Moses, 120 when he passed? So
I mean, yes, let's say 60 or 70, but by the time Rahab gets, she's saved, her and her family, eventually meets Solomon, let's say it even happens within a few years, you know, I mean, so we're talking 50, 60, 70 plus years
yeah,
down the road.
yeah, there's a decent period of chunk of time in between those events, I think.
Okay, so I have a question.
Mhm.
On the male offspring from a marriage with a Moabite was excluded up to 10 generations. So wouldn't it, I mean, God basically overruled that, didn't he? Because
He chose David.
Yeah,
David's not that far down the road.
yeah.
Are you gonna get to that?
Um,
Got the
not-
options for sure. We've seen
Right.
that with Rahab the harlot and.
Right, right.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's also, there was some debate, I've read a number of articles about whether that was for if a Israelite married a Moabite woman versus being the opposite way. I don't. It was a little convoluted, but I think it's better to say that there was an exception made for the situation with David.
I think we see that all the way down the line with Abraham. You know, like you said before, we're not seeking God. God made the move and found us.
Right.
And I think you see that all the way through with Abraham, Isaac, every one of them.
Yeah. Yeah. Cool. Well, thanks for